Okay, so yeah, well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming along. This is the fifth creative sharing session from UBI Lab Arts. UBI Lab Arts started in August 2020, or was it 21? 2020. And it was, came out of the UBI Lab network, and it was specifically sort of aimed at representing artists, whether that's visual, musicians, any kind of performer or creative practitioner. But we're also interested in looking at how UBI can represent people who also work in the creative industries, whether they're working in theatres as sort of box office people or technicians, understanding and acknowledging, but quite often those arts workers may also have an artistic or creative practice, and that's how they pay their bills, and then that's all pay their bills and fund their arts practice or whatever they do creatively. And from that, we started to do these creative sharing sessions where we've invited artists and other people who are creative or working on the fringes of sort of creative projects to come and share things which they're working on or things which they've seen, which they think can help deepen and broaden the conversation about basic income. So I guess the lab and these sessions aren't necessarily designed to create propaganda for the basic income movement or the UBI Lab network. It is a sort of a melting pot where we can sort of talk about the different problems and sticking points of basic income. We know that it's not a perfect policy. There are many pitfalls in this. But we think that this sort of creative space can be used to sort of understand it from different perspectives and sort of challenge some of those more trickier areas of it. But it's also a place where we can share projects which can just communicate the idea to basic income to someone who's never heard of it before in a way that is more imaginative or exciting than a research paper or a policy proposal. I'll hand over to Andy to introduce our first speaker, who's Alessandra, and then we'll start, and then Lynda will go second. But Andy, is there anything I've missed?
You've captured it all, Toby, very well. Again, I think sometimes we like to remind people that the Universal Basic Income Lab Arts is kind of one of the non-geographic labs in the wider UBI Lab network, and we're not necessarily just we're not advocating just for a universal basic income for artists. It's how artists can advocate or broaden and deepen the discussion around universal basic income. So we like to just remind people that we're looking at a kind of wider definition of basic income, but I think as part of that we recognize that artists and art workers are also sort of part of society at large, and kind of thinking about how a basic income would affect those lives is really important. So I think we're really lucky to have sort of Alessandra Saviotti and Lynda today to kind of present from a little bit on those perspectives from the ideas of artists' unions. Alessandra, I know as a curator, she's and researcher. She's part of the Art Util Association, and doing lots of interesting stuff around the idea of useful art. But is also a member of the Art Workers Italia. So I think we had Emanuele Braga present a little bit about their Universal Basic Income Manifesto. But when I was talking to Alessandra recently, we were saying, actually, there was a bit of research that went into that as well to sort of get closer to where that manifesto came from, and it'll be nice to have a recap on that. I'll pass over to Alessandra to present to us for 10 or 15 minutes, and we can have a bit of a chat afterwards before moving to Lynda.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy and Toby, for having me here. I'm very excited because I have been working with with different hats all the time in different capacity, and the work that I have been doing with Art Workers Italia, for me it's really exciting because my background is as a curator and art educator, but I'm pretty much researching how art can become a tool for change. And even though the work of Art Workers Italia, it's not an art project, is try to really find the right tools in order to protect art worker, of course, in the context of Italy. So I put together a short presentation to introduce a little bit what we have been doing. And I'm gonna share my screen. I think it's here. Okay. Okay. All right, so it should be there. So basically, yeah, another reason why I decided to join Art Workers Italia at the very beginning, it's because, I mean, I'm from Italy, obviously, but I have been working and living in the Netherlands, and I'm also doing a PhD at the Liverpool John Moores University. So the reason, like the idea of joining an association that is working for the protection of art workers in Italy might seem a little bit odd, because I'm working mostly in other places. But I really thought that somehow I had this feeling, I was feeling ashamed that in Italy we don't have such a thing, right? Because there's no union, for example, just for visual art workers. There's no association that, you know, like try to protect the rights of art workers, etc., etc. So when Art Workers Italia was born, I was like, okay, I really want to be part of that, because I also think that what we do as art workers, I mean, we have also a responsibility to our own sector, right? So if we spend all the time in complaining about what doesn't work and we never try to find solution ourselves, I believe we can actually change the system, because we are part of that system and we know pretty well our working condition and what does work and what does not. So when Art Workers Italia started as an informal group of art workers, I was really happy to join them. So the association is an independent and non-partisan association of art workers broadly, so not just curators or artists, which was born online during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are relatively, let's say, young. Like the aim was basically to address the art workers' systematic exclusion from the Italian welfare system. So since March 2020, we have been collaborating with experts in the legal and tax administrative sectors, with universities, with policymakers, and also cultural institutions, in order to build legal, fiscal, and political tools to protect art workers, basically. So we also work in cooperation with other groups representing different cultural workers, because we think that it's really, really important to have alliances, like cross-sectoral alliances, let's say. For example, performing art and theater workers, who in Italy are a little bit better organized than visual art workers, but we also collaborate with other let's say, groups that work specifically in the preservation of cultural heritage, for example, because they also started organizing a little bit earlier than us. And basically, we demand the redistribution of resources, fair accessibility to opportunities, transparency, and equity. And these are like the, you know, like the starting point of like the main objective that we had at the beginning. So we have our, like the main goals are what we call the 4 R's. So recognition of the legal status of contemporary art workers, the regulation of employment relationships, fair redistribution of resources, and hopefully the ultimate goal is the reform of the sector. So basically, we try to work following main objectives and main aim every year. As I was saying before, we are the association is relatively young, because it has been, let's say, 2 years that we started working together. And obviously the first 6 months were really, we were really trying to figure out also the legal form that we wanted to have. For example, we decided not to form a union because we thought that it was a little bit early, because somehow it has been the first time that visual art workers are trying to coming together in order to produce tools, to really tools, I mean, also intervene in the legal system. So we said, okay, let's try to build, to go step by step. So we decided to go for the association that would be a little bit more flexible. Yeah, basically we are really trying to lobbying to policymakers and politicians to create better conditions, and with the ultimate goal of ending the constant financial precarity of art workers. Yeah, I was already mentioning that we are trying to produce tools to help carry on transparent working conditions and relationships, such as, for example, fair compensation, guidelines for artists and curators' fees. And we are also trying to build around some education activities, such as seminars and webinars, in order to, create some sort of conversation, and also to spread what we have been doing. And we basically demand the application within Italy and beyond, hopefully, of instruments that have been already available on a European level, for example, because these tools are already there. The problem is to find them and to adapt them to the different contexts, and to really push for the application of those. For example, like the European Parliament resolution of the 7th June 2007 about the social status of artists. It's a very good document that is already there, but because the European Union doesn't have competencies in the countries that are part of the European Union in cultural policy, they cannot really, enforce the application of these kind of instruments that are already there, because it's the competency of the single state. But we are trying to say, listen, these tools are already there, so how can we use it and how can we apply them? So although the association has been invited already to be part of a group of art and cultural workers that is permanent in conversation with our Ministry of Culture. So this was really an achievement, because for a very young association, sometimes it takes really years to be, to sit at the table of the Ministry of Culture. Despite that, the sector is still suffering from a lack of regulation and therefore recognition. And with recognition, I'm particularly referring to the fiscal recognition. The result is that art workers who specifically operate in visual art have been constantly excluded from any form of assistance. And this was, particularly visible during the pandemic, because, for example, in Italy it doesn't exist what is called a TECO code, which is basically the standard classification that you can get for your economic activity. So this doesn't exist for visual arts workers. So, for example, if you're an artist, you can register as like an artisan, something like that. Or if you are a curator, as a journalist, or like some other sort of organizer, but there's no like a particular code that classify the contemporary art workers. And then, of course, it's a problem, because then the sector is really fragmented, and you don't know where to, what to look for when there is something like a pandemic happen and you need some sort of welfare that, support your work. So basically, we like the last year, we did a survey around in order to understand a little bit the condition of contemporary art workers in Italy. So more than 400 people answered to the survey, and this basically are the data, which you can see that are really, you know, like, yeah, like really dramatic, because basically 55% of commissions come with no contracts. And I think the worst data that we got, and this obviously was not unexpected, but then it's quite, you know, yeah, to think about that the 50% of art workers in Italy have an annual income lower than 10,000 euro gross is quite, you know, like preoccupying, you know. So, and this actually was the first time that a sort of survey like that was done. So basically, another example that highlights the lack of literacy also on a governmental level on contemporary art and visual art is demonstrated by this other example. So basically, this is a screenshot of the Senate website. So basically, the government presented and discussed a decree on the status of the arts last year in March. And basically, they tried to, you know, like create, also discuss some legal protection and legal tools for art workers. But despite introducing some aspect of the work, such as rehearsals and replicas, for example, in the case of performing arts, they forget to address research, for example, education, exhibition planning, which obviously exist as part of an invisible process in comparison with respect to, let's say, the moment of performance or of the presentation of work. So also on a governmental level, there is really a lack of awareness of what a visual art worker or contemporary art workers do. So we presented, we basically took the decree, we rewrote the decree, we make some amendments, and we presented to the Senate, to the government, that accepted our amendments. So now they are reworking, hopefully they will listen to us, and they will try to, you know, like integrate also our amendments in the law. So I'm gonna perhaps go a little bit quickly about this, you know, like slide, because obviously we work a lot on a national and regional level, because also like the territory of Italy and also how the regions are organized obviously is really decentralized. However, we are trying to maintain this sort of decentralization also in terms of how we work, but obviously it's really important to have, let's say, a common goal in mind, because it's so fragmented that we cannot really try to decentralize too much, because otherwise it's very difficult also to campaign and advocate for what we want to do. But let's say that on a European level, we really try to demand clarity on the policies that are already in place, as I was trying to say before, because we would like to learn how to use these tools for lobbying with our representatives in Italy. So, so yeah, this is something that we joined a couple of dialogues with the European Commission that they were really interesting, through Voices of Culture, which is a specific program promoted by the Goethe Institute that they are trying to open up the possibility to cultural workers to discuss and propose some changes also in the European policy. And then therefore there is an open dialogue with the policymakers of the European Union that have competencies in culture, that they also can they bring our instances to the politicians. So it's actually very interesting, and it's also like we learned a lot when we were trying to do these things, and it's quite useful then, because you really look into the law and you really understand what you can do basically. So so far, obviously, we know that if we demand more rights, implies that there are more duties, and we are very conscious of that. But we also try to develop these main, let's say, tools so far. So we produced some contract templates And we have been working on a list of frequently asked questions in conversation with the lawyer and an accountant that they have been helping us in answering these frequently asked questions. Then we are working on some guidelines for cultural organizations, and by that I mean that we are trying to develop a fair practice code. Like, let's say that we have been working since the very beginning in developing a sort of minimum fees for artists and curators, some guidelines for that, because in Italy it's completely wild, and we refer, for example, to some fee calculators in the UK or in other countries, but obviously it doesn't work for us. So we have been really trying to compare different approaches and different fee calculators that are already there, and here I've added a bunch of them. So for example, we have been looking at the Trabajadores de Arte, which is a very interesting organization that includes different countries in Latin America. So they have been working together in order to also campaign for fair remuneration for art workers. Then obviously we look at wage, even though the example of the United States, it's, also very complicated to apply in, I guess in all Europe, but specifically in Italy. Then obviously we look at other examples for the Netherlands, for example. We look at Finland, but also to some examples in the UK, because obviously we cannot take a fee calculator and apply it to our context, because it wouldn't work. So we are really trying to compare different examples and to get the best of each one in order to see if we can create our. Another example that I wanted to mention, and I think it's the example of SOTA. I don't know if you came across of this before, but basically it's an association in Belgium. So they wrote this almanac, so this document that informs a large audience of cultural operators about their rights. They provide advice on how to negotiate and where to complain about things that are not going as they should. So it's basically a tool that it's very open to collective practitioners, and it emphasizes on placing, let's say, the struggle of cultural workers on the public debate. So it's quite interesting to see how they work. So let me just see, because I think I'm running a little bit out of time. But basically this slide is about the report that was written in the context of Voices of Culture. So I actually took part in that meeting with the European Commission, and it was quite interesting because we really tried, like it was part of the meeting where other 46 organizations across Europe. So we really tried to look at our specificity and then zoom out and try to write recommendation. So it was also, in this case, a very good exercise and a very interesting, exchange with other cultural workers across Europe. And with cultural workers, I mean that really there was a really broad spectrum of cultural workers, because there were, like, for example, touristic guides, actors, or like people working in movie policies. So it was really, really interesting, but it was also highlighting, because somehow we were all struggling with, with our work, because somehow artwork or cultural work is still hard for, let's say, those working in politics or the government to be recognized as such. So somehow it was like very worrying, but also quite okay. So if this happens also, I don't know, in other places, perhaps we can really come together and do something. So yeah, I'm gonna perhaps skip this because I think it's, yeah, was a specific project, but I can talk about this one instead, which I think is more interesting. We have been, of course, working a lot in Italy in order to understand how we can, produce something to change our conditions, specifically in our country. But at the same time, we are really trying to build alliances and to constitute a network of other organizations working with the same objective that we have, in order to create this sort of, let's say, ecology of good practices, ecology of art and activists that are really producing tools, not just conversation about how to protect art workers. And a section of our website is called the Hypermates. So it's a growing network of organizations that we have been learning from, that they have been learning from us, or we have been in conversation, in exchange, in this kind of situation like it's happening here right now. It's really fruitful, and it's really important to to basically share the difficulties, but also the success, because sometimes it's also very important to learn from the success of the other, right, in order to change and to produce change. And this eventually is the one, let's say, result of this kind of building of network and building of new friendships and new alliances. We joined the Art for UBI manifesto that was put together by, or not put together, but it was coordinated by the Institute of Radical Imagination, which I think you met already, you spoke to them already. But I would say that from our perspective at Art Workers Italia, we have not been looking a lot into the universal basic income, because there is still so much to do in terms of like we are one step behind, right? Like we really need to think about how we can articulate our, let's say, position as art workers and try to get paid for what we do. And obviously the universal basic income, it would be one of the, the tools to look into. But I think we need a little bit more time to do so. So yeah, I would say that we have been also looking at, for example, how other countries have been trying to do so. Obviously, we were reading about the case of Ireland, but also I spent 2 years in San Francisco, and I saw that during the pandemic, a couple of months after it all started, the city of San Francisco, the mayor of San Francisco promoted a universal basic income scheme, but it was not universal because it was just for 100 artists living in the city. And they did so they implemented it for 2 years, but I haven't spoken with anyone who benefit from that. And perhaps it would be interesting to try to hear from some of the artists, or perhaps an interview with them, to understand if it was just like a sort of propaganda move from the mayor, or actually a measure that they really implemented. So yeah, I think that's Art Workers Italia. That's me. Obviously, there are many more things to discuss, but
That's fantastic, Alessandra. Thank you. Really lovely, excellent amount of detail and background, and really useful research that I think you've done, not just for OWI, but for anyone interested in kind of the condition of sort of precarious workers, and particularly people working in the cultural sector. So I mean, we could, I know you're going to have to leave at past, aren't you? So I'm just thinking, so we don't have to sort of rush something at the end. If there's any sort of questions or comments, or anything from any of the other people that are here, I could open up the floor. Go on, Lynda.
Hi, Alessandra. Yeah, I think it's just really easy to see how amazing those parallels are with the issues that are affecting our members. And we've been around for 21 years, so we're still sort of, you know, addressing some of those issues that you're just beginning to start exploring. But yeah, so it's just interesting, really good. Well, good to see the commonalities and the, you know, the different approaches to some of those challenging questions. So yeah, just well done just for starting the journey.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting because, as I said, the association was born during the pandemic. So for example, like we have been always working online, and we're starting now in working somehow in person, but also where? Because the association has the legal, let's say, is registered in Turin, but I have been, let's say, contributing from Amsterdam most of the time, and I've never met the others, for example. And I think it's like, this is not, it's not an obvious thing, because you really have to trust your comrade, like the people that you work with. And imagining that we never met each other for 2 years, and like most of the people that I'm working with for artwork in Art Workers Italia, I've never met them in person. There is a really an amount of trust that we are putting on what we do, and we are all volunteers. So obviously this is also, like, you know, the question of burnout, etc., is always there. But for me, it's really like, it really gave me hope, especially in the first months of starting this journey. So yeah, we'll see how it's going to continue.
Yeah, Alessandra. And Raina, did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, thank you. I really admire any steps to organize, where people come together to organize themselves to represent their interests. Anyway, I'm wondering whether there were any trials to enhance the situation of artists within or by unions. Are there any chapters within unions in Italy who try to represent artists, or is it too difficult to, are they respected by the other workers within the unions?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult, I think, because first there would be the need to really articulate the position as visual. What does it mean to be a visual art workers? And by that, I mean like curators, for example, artists, which is, how can you define an artist? It's quite, you know, people get a little bit nervous when we try to write the definition of that, but also how can, yeah, like it's difficult because, like, I think the emphasis, or at least what we have been trying to say, it's not on who we are, but what we do. And that, I think, is really key in order to understand and to create tools to protect what like our work, like, basically. But in Italy, there is, like, for example, the cultural art workers that work in theater or performing art, they have a longer tradition also of articulating the struggle. So they are better organized somehow. We have been also a lot in contact with them. And for example, they really, I mean, they really put their body on, for example, occupying their spaces. Because somehow, like, the space of the theater, it's, you know, like a sort of symbolic but also physical space to occupy with your body. So somehow, I don't know if it's something that I'm just speculating right now, or I'm thinking about that right now, but I think that is a different approach. And they have better instrument to organize themselves, which means that the government is trying to learn from them, but it forgets that visual, like the cultural workers, it's so much more nuanced. And so you cannot do one thing good and the rest bad and say, I did it. So you know, like, I don't know if this answers your question, but that's my take on that. I'm also going to switch on the light because otherwise I'm disappearing in the dark. So just a second.
You're all right, Alessandra.
Okay.
And Martin, did you have something to add or ask?
Yes, thanks. I mean, I think it sort of follows on a wee bit from Rainer's sort of question, and apologies for being a bit late. When I joined, I think you were saying, Alessandro, that the association, you set up the association and chose perhaps not to set it up as a union, trade union. I was just wondering if you found there's any benefits or any drawbacks in being an association rather than a recognised trade union in terms of access to politicians, to government, to the EU and such like.
Well, this is a good question because honestly, I think that the fact that we were really feeling the urgency to organize was what pushed us to decide to go for an association rather than a union, because somehow it felt a little bit more complicated to organize a union because none of us had any kind of experience in working in a union, for example. And also we really wanted to to work mainly as volunteers in terms of sharing, you know, like the burden of doing that. Because obviously, you know, like, it was also particular condition of starting these kind of things during a pandemic, right? Because like there were so many things going on, but really this was really like, how do you say, like the thing that pushed us to say, okay, we need to be serious now, and we really need to do something, because it's a shame that in Italy is one of the last countries that is trying to organize about that, but not just organize or occupy the theater or, you know, like going to the protest, etc., but really try to getting to know ourselves, what we do as art worker, and try to be serious and try to, you know, like knock the door of the Ministry of Culture and say, listen, we have a problem because we cannot work. Like everything is closed. There's no tool whatsoever that we can use to have access, for example, of this kind of relief that were distributed to, you know, like people that lost their jobs, for example, or they couldn't work. So I think that the choice of being an association, it was like the quickest one. But obviously it's open, like the evolution of the association, it's evolving day after day, so probably would change form.
Excellent, thanks, Ali.